there is a name the world forgot. A name that should be spoken in the same breath as Euclid, Newton, and Leibniz. A name that belongs in every classroom, on every timeline of human intellectual achievement. A name that changed the course of mathematics centuries before the West caught up. His work described the architecture of the universe in pure numbers. He solved problems that would not be formally understood in Europe for another 400 years. He did it not in a grand university, not before a court of kings, not with the applause of a grateful civilization. He did it quietly, almost invisibly, and then he vanished. His name was Zhu Shijie, and this is his story. If you find yourself drawn to the stories of people who changed everything while the world looked away, people who built empires of thought in silence, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe now and join thousands of curious minds who believe that the greatest stories in history are the ones we were never taught in school. To understand Zhu Shijie, you must first understand the world that made him. It is the late 13th century. China is transforming. The Mongol Empire, the largest land empire in human history, has swept across the known world like a force of nature, devastating, reshaping, and paradoxically connecting. Under Kublai Khan, the Yuan Dynasty has been established, and China finds itself at the crossroads of civilization. Traders arrive from Persia, scholars from India, diplomats from Europe. The Silk Road is alive with ideas, goods, and languages. It is a time of rupture and of renewal. The old Confucian civil examination system, the path that once rewarded scholars with government positions, has been disrupted under Mongol rule. For generations, Chinese scholars had studied the classical texts with one eye fixed on official recognition. Now that path was uncertain. The Mongols brought different priorities, different hierarchies, different measures of worth. For most scholars, this was a crisis. For a certain kind of mind, it was a liberation. Without the pressure of the examination system defining what was worth knowing, mathematicians and scientists in Yuan Dynasty China began to explore with a new kind of freedom. The practical arts, engineering, astronomy, calendrical calculation, agriculture, were no longer beneath the learned. Mathematics, once treated as a tool of administration, began to be pursued as something more, as a language of truth itself. The intellectual climate was electric with a strange kind of energy. The chaos of empire had cracked open old certainties, and through those cracks, something unprecedented was beginning to grow. And it was into this world that Zhu Shijie was born. History does not tell us the exact year of Zhu Shijie's birth. It does not tell us his father's name, or his mother's face, or the village where he first opened his eyes to the world. The historical record, as is so often the case with the greatest minds of ancient China, is frustratingly silent about the man himself. What we know is this: he was likely born sometime around 1249, in the region near Yanshan, in what is today the area surrounding Beijing. He lived and worked during the late Song and early Yuan periods, a time of tremendous upheaval. And we know from the evidence of his work alone that somewhere in that turbulent, transforming world, a mind of extraordinary depth was quietly taking shape. We can imagine, and history gives us every reason to, a child who noticed patterns where others saw only noise. A boy who found numbers not cold or intimidating but warm, logical, deeply satisfying. Who discovered early that the world of mathematics had an inner consistency that the human world did not. Perhaps his family was modest, tradespeople, farmers, or minor civil servants. The historical silence on his origins suggests no extraordinary wealth or social prominence. If anything, it suggests the opposite, a man who earned his place in history through intellect alone, not inheritance. There is something deeply moving about that. In a society stratified by birth, by ethnicity under Mongol rule, by wealth and connection, a young man from unremarkable origins would one day produce works that outpaced the entire mathematical tradition of his era. Not because someone handed him the keys to greatness, because he forged them himself. History does not tell us who his teachers were. We do not know whether he sat at the feet of a great master, or whether he was largely self-taught, working his way through the accumulated mathematical texts of Chinese tradition. But we can understand the tradition he inherited. Chinese mathematics at this point in history was already extraordinary. The 9 chapters on the mathematical art, compiled nearly 1,000 years earlier, had established a rich tradition of practical and theoretical computation. The works of Liu Hui, Zhu Shijie, and more recently Yang Hui and Qin Shao had pushed the boundaries of algebra, approximation theory, and numerical methods to remarkable heights. Zhu Shijie did not emerge from a vacuum. He emerged from a living tradition. And what he did with that tradition was nothing less than revolutionary. We can picture the young Zhu Shijie poring over bamboo texts and paper manuscripts, absorbing centuries of accumulated wisdom, not passively but hungrily, testing, questioning, extending, finding the edges of what was known and pressing past them. The most powerful kind of education is not instruction, it is encounter. The moment when a prepared mind meets an idea too large for the existing framework and refuses to look away. Zhu Shijie clearly had that kind of mind. A mind that could not be satisfied with what was already known. A mind that kept asking, but what comes next? Here is something remarkable that history does tell us. Zhu Shijie traveled. For 20 years, by some accounts, he wandered across China, teaching, learning, debating, collecting problems. He moved from city to city, from scholarly community to scholarly community, carrying his mathematics with him like a traveling merchant carries goods, except that what he traded could not be spent or depleted. Knowledge only multiplied in the giving. We know this because he tells us so himself, or rather, the prefaces to his works tell us, written by his contemporaries and admirers. Those prefaces describe a man of extraordinary intellectual energy, sought out by students across the land, a teacher whose reputation preceded him wherever he went. Imagine what that journey looked like. The dusty roads of Yuan Dynasty China, the canal boats threading between cities, the smoky inns where scholars gathered in the evenings to argue about the movement of celestial bodies and the proper calculation of taxes. A man with a brilliant mind and a bundle of manuscripts, moving through a world in flux, gathering insights as he traveled. He was not sheltered by a university. He had no endowment, no permanent position, no guarantee that his work would be remembered. He had only his intellect and his dedication, and he had 20 years of wandering. There is a word for this kind of scholar in Chinese tradition, the yuxue, the traveling learner, the one who does not wait for knowledge to come to them, but sets out into the world to find it. Zhu Shijie was at his core a yuxue, and that wandering shaped everything he became. In 1299, Zhu Shijie was in the city of Guangling, the great city that we today call Yangzhou, and he published his first major work. He had been teaching for years by then. Students had gathered around him wherever he settled. He had a reputation not merely for mathematical ability, but for the ability to make mathematics comprehensible, to break open the sealed chambers of abstract thought and let the light flood in. This is a gift rarer than genius itself. There are many brilliant people in every generation who understand things no one else can understand. There are far fewer who can build the bridge that allows others to follow them. Teaching is not the diminishment of intellect. It is its highest expression. Zhu Shijie understood this. His first great work was not written to impress. It was written to illuminate. It was designed to take a student from the very beginning, from the most elementary arithmetic, and carry them, step by step, through the ascending architecture of mathematical understanding, all the way to the frontier of what was known. He was not interested in hoarding knowledge. He was interested in expanding it, and the fastest way to expand knowledge is to give it away. Every student he taught was a multiplier. Every concept he clarified became a tool in dozens of other minds. The knowledge he spread across China in those 20 years of travel did not simply end when he died. It echoed forward through generations of scholars who built on the foundation he had laid. That is the true measure of a teacher, not what they know, but what they ignite. The Xuanshui Qimeng, Introduction to Mathematical Studies 199, the Xuanshui Qimeng. In English, Introduction to Mathematical Studies. Published in 1299, it was a comprehensive textbook, organized, progressive, masterfully constructed. It covered arithmetic, fractions, proportions, geometry, and the foundations of algebra. It was written for students, but it was far more than a primer. It was a complete map of the mathematical landscape of its time. The book became enormously influential not just in China but across East Asia. It was carried to Korea and Japan, where it shaped mathematical education for centuries. The Xuanshui Qimeng had a particularly deep impact in Korea, where it was reprinted multiple times and used as a core mathematical text for generations of scholars. Think about that for a moment. A book written by a wandering scholar in Yuan Dynasty China, a man whose name most people today cannot even pronounce, quietly shaped the mathematical education of an entire region of the world for hundreds of years. That is not a footnote in history. That is history. But the Xuanshui Qimeng, as remarkable as it was merely the first act. 4 years later, in 1303, Zhu Shijie published the work that would mark him as one of the greatest mathematical minds in human history, the Jade Mirror of the Four Unknowns. Xiwan Yujian. Let us pause on that title for a moment. The Jade Mirror of the Four Unknowns. There is something almost mystical about it. A jade mirror, smooth, reflective, revealing hidden truths. And four unknowns, not one, not two, but four variables, moving simultaneously through a system of equations, describing relationships too complex for a single number to capture. What did Zhu Shijie actually do in this work? In simple terms, he extended algebra to multiple simultaneous unknowns in a way the world had never seen. He developed what is now called the method of four unknowns, a system for setting up and solving polynomial equations involving up to four separate variables at once. He used a spatial representation, literally arranging symbols on a counting board in a grid pattern, with the four unknowns distributed across different axes. If that sounds abstract, think of it this way. When you try to describe the real world, the movement of celestial bodies, the engineering of a great canal, the calculation of complex taxes or trade profits, one variable is never enough. Reality is multidimensional. Cause and effect do not move in a single direction. Events ripple outward in cascading relationships that require a mathematics capable of holding multiple things in tension simultaneously. Zhu Shijie built that mathematics, and he went further. The Jade Mirror also contains his treatment of what we now call finite differences and summation formulas, the mathematical machinery for adding up sequences of numbers according to specific rules. He worked with what are today called Pascal's triangle and the binomial theorem, constructing a diagram of combinatorial coefficients that he used to solve complex problems. Here is the astonishing part. The methods of finite differences that Zhu Shijie developed in 1303 would not be independently discovered in Europe until the work of Gregory, Newton, and Leibniz in the late 17th century. That is a gap of nearly 350 years. 3.5 centuries of European mathematics, working its way forward with enormous effort, eventually arrived at a destination Zhu Shijie had already mapped. He was not ahead of his time, he was ahead of everyone's time. History does not tell us whether Zhu Shijie married. It does not tell us whether he had children, whether he knew laughter and domesticity and the small warmth of ordinary life, or whether he moved through the world as a solitary figure, companioned only by his work. We can imagine both. We can imagine a man who, after years of wandering, found somewhere a place to rest, a home, a family, a hearth, whose children perhaps played in the courtyard while he bent over his counting board, who found in ordinary life the balance that extreme minds sometimes need. Or we can imagine a man entirely consumed by his work, a traveler who never stopped traveling, a scholar whose home was the road and whose family was the succession of students who gathered around him in city after city, hungry for what he could teach them. There is something in the historical silence about his personal life that feels strangely intentional, as though history is telling us, this is not what matters about him. What matters is not the texture of his daily life, but the architecture of his mind. And yet, we must resist that temptation, because the humanization of genius is not a distraction from greatness, it is its foundation. The great intellectual works of history were not produced by abstractions. They were produced by people who felt cold and hunger and loneliness, people who doubted themselves in the dark hours, people who chose again and again to return to the work. Whatever the texture of Zhu Shijie's personal life, that much we can say with certainty. He chose the work. He chose it for 20 years of wandering. He chose it through whatever hardships those years contained. He chose it until he had produced two of the greatest mathematical texts in human history. That kind of choosing is not accidental. It is not the result of favorable circumstance or easy living. It is the result of a man who had found his reason for being and refused to abandon it. What drove Zhu Shijie? Not fame. The historical record makes that clear enough. His name was largely forgotten within a few generations after his death. If he had been pursuing recognition, the universe would have disappointed him profoundly. Not wealth. A wandering scholar in Yuan Dynasty China, moving from city to city without a permanent position, was not building a fortune, not power. Mathematics in 13th century China, however admired among scholars, was not a path to political influence. So what was it? I think it was something far purer and far more dangerous than any of those things. I think it was the compulsion to understand. There is a certain kind of mind, and you may recognize it, perhaps even in yourself, that cannot rest in the presence of an unsolved problem, that feels the incompleteness of partial understanding like a splinter under the skin, that cannot move on, cannot be satisfied, cannot sleep easily until the thing makes sense. Zhu Shijie had that mind, and mathematics, uniquely among all human endeavors, gives that kind of mind a home. Because in mathematics, every question has a real answer. The universe does not lie to you. The numbers do not shift to suit your preferences. The equations either balance or they don't. And when you find the answer, the true answer, the one that makes the whole structure suddenly click into coherence, there is a feeling that no other discipline can replicate. Mathematicians sometimes call it beauty. It is the beauty of truth itself, stripped of all ambiguity, all interpretation, all social complication, pure and unargued and complete. That, I believe, is what drove Zhu Shijie across 20 years of wandering roads and smoky inns and borrowed counting boards. Not the hope of being remembered, the joy of understanding. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Zhu Shijie built his legacy not through visibility, but through the depth of his commitment. The mathematics he left behind was not a trophy. It was a testament to what happens when a person aligns completely with their purpose and refuses to be distracted by the noise of recognition. That mindset, that quiet, relentless dedication to something greater than yourself, is what this channel is built around. And if that philosophy resonates with you, we've built something you might appreciate. Head over to our spring shop and check out our collection of apparel and accessories inspired by the overlooked architects of history. Each piece is a conversation starter, a statement, a reminder that legacy is not built in the spotlight, it's built in the work. Link is in the description. Back to the story. Zhu Shijie's death date, like his birth date, is unknown to history. He simply disappears from the record, as quietly as he appeared. After 1303, after the publication of the Jade Mirror, the historical trail goes cold. We do not know where he spent his final years, whether he continued to teach, whether he produced further work that was lost. We know only that by the 14th century his name had begun to fade. And then something remarkable happened, not in China, not initially, but in Korea. The Swanshu Chimung had traveled across the sea, and in the Korean scholarly tradition it found a home. It was reprinted, studied, and built upon. Korean mathematicians of the Joseon period, scholars like Gyeong Seon Jing and others, worked directly with Zhu Shijie's methods. His algebra, his approach to polynomial equations, his systematic mathematical thinking wove itself into the Korean tradition and persisted there long after it had faded in China itself. Then in the 19th century, a Chinese scholar named Luo Shilin rediscovered the Jade Mirror. What he found astonished him. He wrote a commentary on the work that reintroduced it to Chinese mathematical scholarship. And soon, Western mathematical historians began to take notice too. George Sarton, the great Belgian-American historian of science, described Zhu Shijie as one of the greatest mathematicians of the medieval world. The great sinologist Alexander Wiley wrote about his work in the mid-19th century, bringing him to the attention of European scholars for the first time. They were astonished. Here was a man who had solved problems and developed methods that the entire European tradition, with all its celebrated geniuses and celebrated institutions, had only reached 5 centuries later. The world had finally caught up to Zhu Shijie. It had simply taken 500 years. Let us sit with that for a moment. 500 years. In the span of those 5 centuries, empires rose and fell. Languages were born, transformed, and died. The printing press revolutionized the spread of knowledge. The scientific revolution remade the European understanding of the cosmos. Newton sat under his apple tree. Leibniz built his calculus. The Industrial Revolution transformed how human beings lived and worked and related to their world. And through all of that, the work of Zhu Shijie sat in manuscripts and reprints, largely unknown to the great movement of Western science, carrying within it the seeds of ideas that the West was still laboring to produce. There is a question this raises that I find deeply uncomfortable and deeply important. How much of what we call progress is actually rediscovery? How many brilliant solutions to the great problems of human civilization have been developed, lost, and then painstakingly redeveloped, not because the knowledge was impossible to reach, but because the knowledge was not properly transmitted, not properly valued, not properly preserved. Zhu Shijie's story is not just the story of one extraordinary man. It is a meditation on the fragility of knowledge itself. Knowledge does not persist automatically. It requires stewards. It requires teachers. It requires people who understand that the truths of one generation must be actively carried forward, or they will be lost and some future generation will have to discover them all over again. Zhu Shijie understood this. It is why he spent 20 years teaching. It is why he published his work rather than keeping it to himself. It is why he wrote not just for the brilliant but for the beginner. He knew that the greatest threat to knowledge is not ignorance, it is silence. Lesson 1. Greatness does not require visibility. Zhu Shijie produced 2 of the most significant mathematical works in the history of human civilization. He did so without a permanent position, without institutional support, without fame. His name was forgotten within a generation of his death. And yet his work shaped the mathematical education of 2 nations. And yet his methods anticipated developments that the entire Western tradition took 5 centuries to rediscover. If he had measured his greatness by the recognition he received in his lifetime, he would have found himself unrecognized. If he had measured it by the visibility of his name in the centuries after his death, he would have found himself invisible. But greatness is not measured in recognition. It is measured in impact. And impact does not always announce itself. Sometimes it works silently beneath the surface, shaping what comes next in ways that will only be understood much later, if ever. Lesson 2, the discipline to show up every day for the work. 20 years of traveling, 20 years of teaching, then the Shuanshui Qimeng, then 4 more years, then the Jade Mirror. Genius is not a burst of inspiration. It is the accumulated result of thousands of days of showing up, of choosing the work over comfort, over certainty, over the easier path of settling for what is already known. Zhu Shijie did not produce his masterwork in a flash of sudden illumination. He produced it through decades of preparation, through all the problems he solved that no one remembers, through all the students he taught whose names are lost to history, through all the miles he walked on roads that no longer exist. The masterwork was just the visible tip of an enormous invisible mountain of effort. It always is. Lesson 3, knowledge is not property, it is responsibility. Zhu Shijie could have kept his mathematics to himself. He could have written it in a form deliberately obscure, as some scholars in many traditions have done, protecting their discoveries from competitors and imitators. He did the opposite. He wrote a textbook for beginners. He traveled for 20 years to share what he knew. He published his most advanced work not in code, but in the clearest form he could manage. He understood that knowledge only fulfills its purpose when it is shared. That the greatest thing you can do with a powerful idea is to put it in the hands of someone who can use it, and trust them to carry it forward. Lesson 4, purpose over recognition, discipline over comfort. In a culture that valued Confucian scholarship and official advancement, Zhu Shijie chose a different path. He did not spend his life pursuing the examinations that might have brought him status. He pursued mathematics, the work that mattered to him, regardless of what that pursuit would or would not bring him. There is a courage in that choice that is easy to overlook from the outside. It takes real courage to devote your life to something that your society does not fully value, to follow the pull of your purpose even when the external rewards are uncertain, to choose depth over status, meaning over comfort. Zhu Shijie made that choice. And his life, in retrospect, was the richer for it, not in comfort or recognition, but in meaning. His legacy proved his purpose right. Somewhere in China in the early 14th century, a man grew old. We do not know where he was when the end came. We do not know whether he was surrounded by students or alone, whether he died in peace or in difficulty, whether he knew in those final days that what he had built would matter. Probably he did not know. Probably he could not have imagined that centuries later, scholars in Korea would be studying his textbook, that Western historians of science would call him one of the great minds of the medieval world, that his methods would be recognized as having anticipated Newton and Leibniz by 350 years. He simply did the work. He did it because it was true, because it was important, because someone had to do it and he was the one who could. That is the full weight of Zhu Shijie's life, not the fame he never had, not the recognition he never received, but the extraordinary, patient, relentless commitment to understanding, carried across 20 years of wandering roads, 2 landmark books, and a legacy that outlasted the empire he lived in. The Jade Mirror of the 4 unknowns. 4 unknowns. 4 variables moving through a system of equations, describing relationships too complex for a single number to capture. Perhaps that is the deepest metaphor his work offers us. Life, too, is a system of multiple unknowns. We do not know what our efforts will produce. We do not know who will be shaped by our work, or when, or in what way. We do not know whether the world will notice what we give it. We can only set up the equations as carefully as we can, do the work as honestly as we can, and trust that the answer, when it finally resolves, will be true. If this story moved you, if the quiet persistence of Zhu Shijie feels like something worth carrying with you, I have one simple request. Subscribe, not because we need the number, but because this channel exists to keep telling stories like this one. Stories of minds that built empires of thought in the margins of history. Stories that remind us that greatness is not the exclusive property of the celebrated, the privileged, or the remembered. And share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their work matters, even if the world hasn't noticed yet. Leave a comment below telling me which lesson from Zhu Shijie's life resonates most deeply with you. I read everyone. The link to our spring shop is in the description, where you'll find pieces inspired by the philosophy of quiet greatness. Wear the reminder that legacy is built in the work, not the applause. Until the next story. The world did not remember Zhu Shijie for 500 years, and still he was right all along.